So before this meeting, I happened to measure my writing desk. I have a desk that I use for writing and a desk that I use at the computer. And the writing desk has 55-inch diagonal, and it's about the same shape as a monitor. My monitors are 40-inch, but you can't get those anymore. Televisions now start at about 49, 50 inches or so. So roughly speaking, my computer monitor is about the same size as my physical desktop. And given that, why do we use the word virtual? Why do we talk about a virtual desktop? Why don't we just talk about a vertical desktop for displaying things and a horizontal desktop for putting things on? And one of them belongs to the computer, if you like. One of them belongs to books and papers and keyboards and mice and that sort of thing. And while we're at it, talking about language, why do we use the word monitor? I haven't looked it up, but I think computer monitors probably started in around the 1950s, where they provided more information than the blinking lights that were traditional. And the computer monitor was allowed to allow the computer operator to see what the computer was doing, just as a heart monitor allows the surgeon or the intensive care ward to know how the patient is doing. Now, what we call a computer monitor has an entirely different purpose most of the time for us. Most of the time for us, the whole purpose of the computer is to show things onto the monitor. So it's not a monitor anymore. It's not monitoring a separate process. It is the process. We might, in the corner of our monitor, have a little device that tells us how much CPU and memory and disk we're using. That's a monitor. It's monitoring the performance of the computer and the use of the computer resources. But mostly the monitor is a real device. And it's, to me, I think of it as the vertical desktop. And it's big like your desktop is. It's got about the same sort of size. And in the old days, you had a choice of orienting your monitor vertically or horizontally, depending on whether you were a computer programmer and wanted long lines or whether you were a designer and wanted page proportions. But nowadays, it doesn't make sense if you've got a 40, 50-inch monitor, because in the landscape orientation, it still fills the whole the whole visual field. So the game has changed quite a bit. And I'm finding using this large monitor actually a bit of a frustration, because the software doesn't really exist to do everything properly. It's sort of designed for regular sized monitors and perhaps laptops as well. There are things called tiling window managers where you don't overlap things. It sort of takes care of the rearrangement of things for itself. And I haven't found one that works well out of the box for that either. So I think the typography I'm using the word typography in the same way as we talk about web typography. I think the typography, the use of large monitors the size of your physical desk, is something that hasn't really been developed. And I think that's a pity, because whilst they're not cheap, a lot of houses have one anyway, because they're televisions. Television is a large monitor. And something very useful has happened recently, which is the Raspberry Pi 4, which still costs $35, will now display on a 4K monitor. It's got the graphics capabilities to display 4K at full resolution. Whereas if you use an ordinary PC, you might have to get a special graphics card that will cost you £80 or something. So the situation with monitors is getting quite different, and I think it will get more and more different. You know, this change will continue more over time. The unfortunate pandemic means that children are studying at home, and if they can use TV monitor as a computer, well, that's great. So I'm seeing in the 21st century, I'm sort of looking ahead beyond my death. I was born in the middle of the last century, and if I do well, I'll see the middle of the present century. But in the 21st century, assuming we can solve all the problems of global warming and conflicts of various sorts and all sorts of other things, in the 21st century, the situation regarding typography and computers and monitors and everything else would be quite different now. If we think back to Nelson's time, tech is about 50 years old. That's a sort of a period. It's about half a century. And if we think forward to another half century, to 2070, there's going to be an enormous difference in the capabilities of all sorts of devices. So now might be a good time to start thinking about rethinking some of the stuff we do regarding typography. So once we start rethinking typography in terms of the output device not being a printing press or a laser printer or a PDF viewer, but being a monitor, a virtual desktop the same size as your physical desktop, once you start thinking about that sort of thing, then a lot of the problems some of the problems that are important in tech-related typography and typography of that nature cease to be relevant. Breaking paragraphs into pages no longer makes sense. And floating figures, placement of figures no longer makes sense. You can see, you can have an enormous double page spread if you want, and the figure can stay still as the text scrolls by. You don't have to fix the placement of the figure. And something else you can do is in the margins of the monitor, you've got room that you can use to put other relevant material, such as earlier figures, so that you remember them. And if I'm reading the page and it mentions equation 14, I'd actually quite like to see somewhere on the screen the number 14 together with that equation. So I don't actually have to go physically to where equation 14 is stated, it's just there. And if I think about when I'm working on a physical desk, what happens is I've got something in the center, which is the thing I'm working on. I'm either reading it or writing notes on it or writing something. And then around me are relevant things. And part of my activity consists of getting something that's relevant and putting it so I can see it. And when it ceases to be relevant, putting it to one side so that there's clear space around it. So these are the sorts of things that certainly have a design element, and I think that some of them certainly have a typographic element. There's something else that can be done, which is that anything that's displayed on the screen can be shared in a way that the contents of your physical desk can't easily be shared. And so that's another matter. And that's quite relevant today with so many seminars taking place online, because at present, you display your slides, if you're giving a talk, you display your slides to the audience by screen sharing, which is a sort of awkward business. And wouldn't it be better if I had on my virtual desktop a copy of, if I had your slides, and when you move forward a slide, my slides would move forward that same slide. So we're actually looking at the same thing, but without doing screen sharing. And that would make a number of things, I think, much better, and it would certainly improve the communication. So that's the sort of general way of thinking that is going through my mind quite a bit in terms of rethinking what's going on. There's something else, which is with print, resolution is quite cheap. In other words, 600, 1,000 or more DPI. It's not that expensive if you're printing off in largish numbers. Whereas color generally is a bit expensive, and even if you use full color process, it's sort of not generally not particularly good. Whereas for computer monitors, resolution I'd say is expensive and color is cheap. So the sort of the typographic costs are a bit different. So that's my little talk about what I'm interested in terms of typography. And whilst I might have very big ambitions about what might be done, I know that I'm quite small and puny, particularly by myself. And so I try to limit what I do try to achieve. But it's quite useful as a force for thinking about things in terms of, will this thing help in this longer term or will it not? And it's also quite helpful thinking about the future role of PDF. PDF has got a very solid and secure role, just as, for example, internal combustion engines of various sorts have a solid and secure role. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking for alternatives, and alternatives won't come. So I'll stop now because I've run out of breath.
Okay, I'd like to comment that large display surfaces, of course, have been common for a long time in newspapers and magazines. But the way they're dealt with is that the large space is broken up into columns. And the reason for the columns is it's very hard to read lines that are quite wide. Anything more than roughly the span of your hand is really too wide to read comfortably. And so newspapers tend to go for relatively narrow columns, about the length of perhaps a finger. And of course, narrow columns then brings back the problems of hyphenation and justification that in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was viewed as the really hard problems in typography. H&J it was called. We've gotten, I think, a lot better of it, especially thanks to programs like TeX, and also with font design, where fonts have been chosen to get more characters into a given width. For example, the Times Roman font that is extremely popular in the United States, I think was chosen largely because you could squeeze more text onto a line. And it's still quite a readable font. I think we can use the screen model, and I like the idea of being able to have equations and figures sticking around. If you could somehow grab a portion of the document you're reading and shove it to the side so it's still visible and carry on, I think that would be a useful thing to have, but I don't think it belongs necessarily in the typesetting system. I think what you'd like to have is that the display system has sufficient markup around typographic objects that for any document, no matter whether it was produced by TeX or a word processor or any other system, you could do the same actions, grab this picture or this equation and push it to the side. Similarly, with the back-referencing equations and figures and tables, we ought to have standards for forward and backward linking. I mean, I've noticed, for example, that in some document viewing systems, you can follow a forward link, but you can't get back to where you were before without laboriously retracing your steps through the document sequentially. And that's, I think, rather a big fault. One really needs the ability to pop away, look at something else, and then return to exactly where you were before.
I'm really grateful for that. There's one phrase you used that I thought was wonderful, which was document viewing system, which in a nutshell covers a large class of objects of interest, including the newspaper that you started with, and including the book. If we adapt that word a little bit and talk about an information viewing system, then, well, the thing I don't like about a document viewing system is it makes you think as though what you're viewing is one document. And quite often document viewing systems are designed to view a single document. Whereas, for example, when we're programming, we'll be looking at, heaven forbid, Stack Overflow, and our Python code and everything else, and producing links between the various things. And so we're not looking at one document, which is our computer software source, and another document, which is a page on Stack Overflow. We're actually sort of constructing a composite document. And then the other difference is that we have a capability of authoring. By and large, on newspapers, the only opportunities we have for authoring is solving the crossword and solving the Sudoku. Whereas when we're computing, we actually do want to be authoring. And in fact, our very act of reading can be an act of authoring, in the sense that we can be making notes on what we're reading. And the fact that we read such and such an article at such and such a time is something that we might want to keep a log of. So a sort of information viewing system and information editing system is the vision I have for these large monitors and the computers and networks that are associated with them. I'll stop at that point.
I will just interject that several years ago, I was visiting colleagues in our Department of Computer Science, and I was invited into the office shared by two graduate students, and they had a rather large display. It filled the entire wall. They had replaced their computer monitors by a projection system, and they loved it and said they never wanted to go back to a small glass panel. They much preferred having a wall full of information. I never worked myself in that environment. I have two 32-inch displays at home and two 27-inch at work. So I have a somewhat larger space than most people, but I'm not sure how I would deal with the wall of information. Perhaps it could be information overload.
There's a fantastic book called The Psychology of Computer Programming, written by Gerald Weinberg. And he was thinking, this was in the 1970s, and he was thinking a bit out of the box. He said, well, why do we assume that computers only have one keyboard? Why should they not have two keyboards? And you might think, oh, that's a bit very crazy. But nowadays, pair programming is an established part of software development. And if two people are working together, why don't they have two keyboards and two mouses, two mice? And why don't they just share a large display area? And when one of them wants to show somebody something, or, you know, you can actually physically move the document from one part of the desk to another part of the desk. It seems to me a sort of, well, pre-COVID, it seems to be a sort of quite sociable way to deal with things, rather than emailing the document or anything else like that. You just move it from one desk to another. And so the graduate students you were talking about, Nelson, is similar to the fact that computer display is becoming so relatively cheap compared to human time that we don't care that we don't use all of the display all of the time. I'll shut up now. Jim, you want to talk?
Just a thing. For a couple of years, I worked at a company called Smart Technologies, which makes big smart whiteboards that they use in schools a lot and stuff, and they use them internally as well. There was a lot of, so you had a big display that you were able to manipulate directly, either with your fingers or with a stylus that they had, and they used that in a lot of ways. There was a lot of direct manipulation of stuff on the screen. They would drag it from one thing to another. It integrated with the laptops. I don't work for them anymore, but I was impressed with what they were doing, and they put it to good use within. And I think there's ideas from that sort of universe that might be useful in what you're talking about.
Apart from VMS, one other rather antiquated thing I still spend time on is Usenet. And these days, one often notices that people assume that everyone sees their post in the same manner that they see it themselves, because they're using HTML or MIME or things like this, which is really an addition to what Usenet is supposed to do. and someone reading it as text only doesn't see it as it is intended. And with a big monitor, you know, it might be nice to have the figures stay in one place and the text flow around it, and so on and so forth, as you were talking about. But at least in many areas, for example, writing scientific papers, at the end of the day, most people will not be reading it on a huge screen. They might be reading it on something about A4 size, which is portable, which is about the maximum portable screen you have, an iPad or something like that. And so there might be a danger, you know, if it looks nice on the big monitor, you have to keep in mind that if you're writing not for yourself, but for someone else, be in a form that they can digest it well.
I'm sorry, I missed some of that because my internet connection was poor. I assume it's going to fit into the recording and I'm the only one that missed it. So pretend I heard it.
No, just very briefly, the big monitor shouldn't tempt one to think that everyone who reads what you're writing will read it in the same environment. They might be a small screen. It still has to be workable in that environment as well.
Indeed, and it might be yourself that's reading it on your mobile phone.